Hey everyone, hope you're doing great. Welcome back to my channel. In today's video, we'll dive into what if Deku was experimented on by Hydra and gained unstable powers. Smash that subscribe button, and be sure to peek at the description below. Let's begin. The world was screaming. It screamed in the shrill, synthetic wail of alarms that clawed at the inside of his skull. It screamed in the groaning tear of stressed metal and the percussive crump of distant explosions. It screamed in the garbled shouts of men whose language he barely registered as words anymore, just tones of panic and fury. But loudest of all, it screamed inside him. A high-frequency thrum vibrated behind his teeth, a constant companion that tasted of ozone and looked like shattered glass in the corner of his vision. It was the hum of his own wrongness, the discordant song of a body at war with the universe it occupied. He ran, bare feet, calloused and dirty, slapped against the cold, unforgiving steel of the corridor floor. The air was a toxic cocktail of acrid smoke, chemical accelerants, and the coppery tang of his own blood, which dripped from his nose in a slow, steady rhythm, a morbid metronome counting down the seconds he had left. The garment he wore, a thin, sleeveless tunic of rough gray fabric, was already stained dark at the collar. Stamped over the left breast, in stark black ink, was a single-digit 0, subject 0. The vessel. The blank slate. Chimera. He had other names, he thought. A name from before. A name that belonged to a boy with green hair and a mother's smile and a world that wasn't painted in sterile white and bruised purple. The memory was a ghost, a half-remembered dream that brought a sharp, stabbing pain to his temples whenever he reached for it. It was safer not to reach. The corridor stretched before him, a nightmarish tunnel of flickering fluorescent lights and deep, oppressive shadows. Red emergency strobes painted the walls in bloody, rhythmic flashes. Containment breach. A robotic female voice droned from hidden speakers, the words sharp and emotionless. Subject 0 is unsecured. Lethal force authorized. Chimera is loose. Chimera. That was the name they gave the power. The monster they had shoved inside his quirkless body. The screaming thing that was currently trying to tear its way out. He rounded a corner, his gaunt frame moving with a desperate, twitchy grace born of years of agonizing stimulus response training. A squad of 4 soldiers stood ahead, clad in dark tactical gear emblazoned with the grotesque, multi-headed serpent of Hydra. They raised their rifles, laser sights dancing like angry red fireflies on his chest. Freeze, asset! On your knees, now! The lead soldier barked. The word asset was a key. It unlocked a memory, not soft and blurry like the one of his mother, but sharp and cold as a scalpel. Flashback. He was smaller. 10 maybe? Strapped to a chair that was cold against his bare skin. The room was blindingly white, the only color a tray of gleaming silver instruments. A man stood over him, tall and severe, his face hidden behind a sterile green mask. But his eyes, they were chips of ice. This was the Baron. The lead scientist. The architect of his pain. You are no longer a person. The Baron's voice was a low, cultured rumble, devoid of any warmth. You are an investment. A resource. An asset to be molded for a greater purpose, order. Your desires are irrelevant. Your pain is data. Remember that. A needle, thick as a nail, pressed against his arm. The boy, he was still a boy then, began to cry. Data, the Baron repeated, and pushed the needle in. The memory vanished as quickly as it came, leaving a fresh wave of terror in its wake. They saw him as a thing to be put back in its cage. His body moved before his mind could form a coherent thought. It was pure, primal instinct. Danger ahead. Cannot go through. Must go past. The world dissolved into a sickening lurch. For a sliver of a second that felt like an eternity, reality lost its meaning. He was nowhere and everywhere, a stream of dislocated information. The air tore with a sound like ripping fabric, and a faint blue afterimage of his form hung in the space he had just occupied. He reappeared 10 feet behind the soldiers, stumbling as the world violently stitched itself back together around him. The short-range teleport, the blink, as the technicians had clinically labeled it, sent a spike of agony through his brain, as if a railroad spike had been driven between his eyes. The soldiers, trained for firefights and tactical assaults, were not trained for this. They spun around, shouting in confusion, their movements suddenly clumsy and slow. Where did he? He didn't give them time to finish. He scrambled for a heavy door marked Medical Bay. Locked. Of course. He slammed his palm against the reinforced steel. He didn't focus, didn't try to control anything. He just pushed his fear, his pain, his desperate need to get away into the point of contact. The thrumming in his bones intensified, and the air around his hand shimmered, warping like a heat haze. For a moment, his hand became insubstantial. He felt a nauseating, vertigo-inducing sensation of non-existence as his fingers sank into the metal. It wasn't hot or cold, it was nothing. He was touching a concept, not an object. He pushed, and his arm slid through the door up to his shoulder. On the other side, he fumbled for the locking mechanism, his semi-corporeal fingers struggling to find purchase. He's phasing! Open fire! The bullets were a storm of hornets. Most sparked harmlessly against the door, but several tore through the space where his back had been a second ago. He found the lever, a heavy mag lock release, and wrenched it down. With a hiss of depressurizing air, the door slid open. He yanked his arm back out, a scream catching in his throat as sensation flooded back into his nerves. The door slid shut behind him, but not before he saw the effect his phasing had left. The steel around the hole where his arm had been was groaning and buckling, its molecular structure compromised, glowing with faint, fractal-like patterns of blue light. He was in a laboratory. Worse, it was one of the operating theaters. A sterile, automated surgical table sat in the center of the room under a harsh overhead lamp. Empty cages lined one wall. Syringes and medical tools were scattered across stainless steel counters, abandoned in haste. The smell of antiseptic was so strong it made his eyes water, and it triggered another cascade of memories. Flashback. The pain was white-hot, electric. Wires were attached to his skull, his spine, his limbs. A machine beside him hummed, its screen displaying a chaotic waveform of vibrant, impossible colors. The energy is not binding to his cellular structure, a technician said, her voice strained. It's rejecting him. Sir, the cellular decay is accelerating. The Baron stood observing from behind a pane of glass. Increase the voltage. Force the bond. His body is a vessel. It will learn to contain it, or it will be replaced. Izuku. He remembered his name in that moment of pure agony, a name he screamed until his throat was raw, convulsed on the table. The world turned to fire and noise. The humming machine beside him exploded in a shower of sparks. The lights in the room burst. For a brief, terrifying moment, the technician saw it, his skin, cracking like porcelain, glowing from within with a light that did not belong in this reality. That was the first time. The first time the chimera had woken up. He choked back a sob, pressing a hand to his head as the phantom pain of the experiments echoed through him. He had to keep moving. The soldiers were already trying to cut through the door. He scanned the room. No other exits. Just a reinforced observation window looking into another corridor. He was trapped. Panic, cold and sharp, seized him. The thrumming intensified. The whispers started. They were always there, in the back of his mind, a constant background static. The quantum noise of the universe, the scientists had theorized. A side effect. Now, fueled by his fear, they grew louder, coalescing into faint, overlapping voices speaking in languages that had never been invented. They spoke of dying stars and nascent realities, of possibilities that branched and folded in on themselves. It was the sound of everything happening at once, and it was driving him insane. Fractured timeline, collapse imminent, unstable vessel. Shut up, he whimpered, clutching his head. The lights above him flickered violently in response to his agitation. A beaker on a nearby counter vibrated, then shattered into a cloud of fine dust. The grinding sound from the door stopped. A new sound replaced it, the heavy, magnetized clank of something large locking into place. A shaped charge. They were going to blow the door. There was no time. No way out. He was cornered. Like a rat, and a cornered rat will chew through steel to escape. He backed away from the door, his eyes fixed on the observation window. It was thick, multi-layered plexiglass, designed to withstand explosions and stray power manifestations. It was impassable. No. The thought was not his own. It was a cold, logical whisper that cut through the cacophony. Nothing is impassable. Only improperly disassembled. He didn't understand the words, but he understood the intent. His terror and desperation began to curdle, twisting into something else. Something hot and furious. They had done this to him. They had turned him into this thing. They had stolen his life, his name, his very self. And now, after all that, they wouldn't even let him run. A raw, guttural scream tore from his throat, a sound of pure, unadulterated anguish and rage. He threw his hands forward, not at the window, but at the door he knew was about to explode. He didn't want to just stop them. He wanted them to be gone. Power answered his rage. It wasn't a blink or a phase. This was raw, untamed, and utterly destructive. A wave of visible distortion erupted from his hands, a lens of warped space that shot across the room. It didn't make a sound as it moved, but the air in its wake screamed as it was torn apart and stitched back together. The wave struck the reinforced steel door. For an infinitesimal moment, nothing happened. Then, the door ceased to be. It did not explode. It did not melt. It simply deconstructed. The complex alloy, the locking mechanisms, the very atoms that composed it were unwound, turning into a silent, expanding cloud of elemental dust and shimmering, exotic particles. The wave of annihilation didn't stop. It passed through the space the door had occupied and washed over the Hydra squad on the other side. The men didn't even have time to scream. One moment they were there, flesh, bone, armor, and weapons. The next they were gone. Erased. Their component matter scattered into the same cloud of glittering dust that now hung in the corridor, slowly drifting to the floor. The backlash was immediate and catastrophic. It felt as if every cell in his body was being set on fire, and then flash-frozen. The glowing, fractal cracks that were a telltale sign of his power's overuse bloomed across his arms and chest, searing lines of blue-white light burning through his tunic. The trickle of blood from his nose became a gushing torrent, hot and thick. His vision dissolved into a blinding white static, and the thrumming in his bones became a deafening roar. He collapsed to his knees, gasping, his body convulsing. He had killed them. He hadn't meant to, not really. He had just wanted them to go away. The power didn't differentiate. It had simply obeyed his most primal, violent emotion. A new sound cut through his haze of pain. A heavy, rhythmic stomping. More soldiers. But these sounded different. Heavier. He forced himself to look up, his vision swimming. Through the shimmering dust cloud in the hallway, two figures emerged. They were huge, encased in thick, exoskeletal armor that looked like a grotesque fusion of man and machine. They carried heavy-caliber weapons that whined as they powered up. Hydra heavy troopers. The ones they sent when a problem needed to be not just solved, but obliterated. Target is weakened but still active, one of them said, his voice a distorted, metallic growl. Deploying dampener field. Capture protocols engaged. One of the troopers raised a device on his arm. It began to emit a low, gut-wrenching hum. Izuku felt it instantly. It was like being submerged in molasses. The chaotic energy inside him felt sluggish, suppressed. The whispers in his head faded, and for a second, the quiet was a relief. But it also meant his escape routes, his blinks, his phases, were being choked off. He had to get out. Now. He staggered to his feet, his body screaming in protest. He ignored the troopers, ignored the corridor. His eyes were locked on the observation window. He had one big attack left in him, he could feel it. One more surge before his body completely gave out. He lurched forward, breaking into a shambling run, aiming himself at the window. He's going for the glass. Stop him! They opened fire. The rounds from their cannons weren't normal bullets. They were heavy, concussive slugs that exploded on impact. The first one hit the floor near his feet, and the shockwave threw him off balance. The second slammed into his shoulder. The pain was immense, but it was a familiar, physical pain. It was almost a relief compared to the existential agony of his power. The impact spun him around, and he crashed against the central operating table. His head struck the metal with a sickening crack. His vision tunneled. The room swam. He was fading. This was it. They were going to drag him back to the white rooms, back to the needles and the Baron's cold eyes. No. The thought was a defiant spark in the encroaching darkness. He remembered a flash of green hair, a freckled face, a notebook filled with drawings of heroes. All Might's brilliant, unwavering smile, a dream he once had. A dream of being a hero. He wasn't a hero. He was a monster. But even a monster could refuse to go back in its cage. With the last dregs of his strength, he pushed himself off the table. He could feel the energy gathering inside him, a final, desperate reservoir. But it was wild, untamed. He couldn't unleash another wave of destruction. He would take out the whole level, and himself with it. He needed to focus it. A single point. He remembered watching the technicians test a new mining laser, cutting through feet of solid rock with a focus beam. Focus. He stumbled toward the window, dragging his wounded body. The troopers were reloading, the dampener field making their movements sluggish as well. He had seconds. He pressed both hands against the cold plexiglass. He closed his eyes, shutting out the swirling room, shutting out the pain in his shoulder, shutting out everything but the space directly in front of his palms. He didn't think of destruction. He thought of an opening. A door. The energy surged, but this time, it didn't erupt outwards. It coalesced, drawing in on itself, becoming a point of impossible density between his hands. The air crackled. The glass beneath his palms began to glow, not with the chaotic blue of his own energy, but with a pure, white-hot light. It didn't crack or shatter, it sublimated, turning directly from solid to gas with a soft hiss. He pushed, and a perfect, person-sized hole appeared in the multi-foot-thick window. He fell through it more than ran, landing in a heap in the corridor on the other side. He didn't look back. He just scrambled to his feet and ran. He could hear the troopers yelling, their heavy footfalls resuming their pursuit, but he had a head start. This corridor was different. It was slanted upwards. An access tunnel? He could feel a change in the air pressure, a faint, almost imperceptible breeze. It smelled of damp earth and pine needles. The surface. He was close. Hope, a dangerous and unfamiliar emotion, surged through him. It gave his legs a strength they shouldn't have possessed. He ran, ignoring the fire in his lungs and the agony in his shoulder. The tunnel grew steeper. He could see a glimmer of light ahead. Not the sterile, flickering light of the facility, but a soft, gray light. Dawn. He burst out of the tunnel mouth, which was hidden behind a curtain of thick ivy on a rocky hillside. And for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, he was outside. The sensory overload was absolute. The sheer, overwhelming green of the forest. The cool, damp air on his skin, so different from the sterile, recycled atmosphere of the lab. The smell of wet soil, of pine, of decaying leaves. The sound of birdsong, a gentle, natural melody that was utterly alien to his ears. It was too much. It was beautiful and terrifying all at once. He stood there, swaying, for a whole second, simply trying to process it all. Freedom. This was freedom. Then the world ended behind him. He had been the epicenter of the breakout. His powers, chaotic and reality warping, had destabilized the very fabric of the facility. The deconstructed door, the phased wall, the hole bored through the window, they were like cracks in a dam. Now the dam broke. There was no explosion, no thunderous boom. There was only a silent, blinding flash of white light from the tunnel mouth he had just exited. The light didn't illuminate, it consumed. It warped the very air around it, bending trees and rocks inwards like they were being sucked into a vacuum. A wave of profound silence washed over the forest, snuffing out the birdsong, the wind, everything. It was the sound of reality being scrubbed clean. The hillside where the entrance had been simply imploded. The earth, the rocks, the trees, all folded in on themselves and vanished, leaving a perfectly smooth, glassy crater that shimmered with residual energy. The entire multi-level, subterranean Hydra facility, and everyone still inside it were gone, collapsed into a pocket of mangled space-time. The psychic shockwave hit Izuka like a physical blow. The sudden, violent erasure of so many lives, the sheer wrongness of the event, overloaded his already frayed senses. The whispers in his head became a single, unified, deafening scream. His legs gave out. The strength that hope had given him vanished. The accumulated toll of the escape, the blinks, the phasing, the two massive expenditures of power, the bullet wound, the sheer terror, all came crashing down on him at once. He pitched forward, landing on a bed of soft moss. The glowing cracks on his skin, which had been fading, flared one last time with a brilliant, final pulse of blue light before extinguishing, leaving behind faint, scar-like patterns that looked like lightning trapped beneath his skin. The world narrowed to a pinprick. The last thing he saw was the canopy of unfamiliar trees against the gray, morning sky. The last thing he felt was the cool, damp earth beneath his cheek. Then, for the first time in years, there was silence. Blessed, empty, and complete. Izuku Midoriya, Subject Zero, collapsed into the abyss of unconsciousness, a broken piece of a broken puzzle, lost in a world he no longer knew. Shota Aizawa, known to the public as the pro-hero Eraserhead, landed silently on a thick branch, his capture weapon settling around his shoulders. The call had been bizarre. A seismic anomaly and a massive, localized energy spike in the Mizurufu prefectural forest, an area that was supposed to be empty. No registered quirks of that magnitude. No villain activity reported, just a sudden hole in the energy readings of the grid, followed by a wave of distortion that had made every sensor in a 5-mile radius go haywire. His goggles were down, his eyes scanning the area. It was eerily quiet. No birds, no insects. Just the faint rustle of wind through the leaves. Ahead, he saw the source of the disturbance. A crater. It wasn't a normal crater. The edges were too smooth, almost like polished obsidian. The ground inside seemed to shimmer, and the air above it felt strangely thin and distorted. Aizawa's eyes, trained to see the subtle signs of quirk usage, narrowed. This wasn't the result of a simple explosion or impact. This felt fundamentally wrong. The laws of physics felt bent and bruised here. He carefully made his way to the edge, his senses on high alert. The energy readings, even without equipment, were off the charts. It felt like standing on the edge of a static field, making the hairs on his arms stand on end. Then he saw it. Lying just a few yards from the crater's edge, half hidden in the moss and undergrowth, was a figure. A boy. Aizawa's approach was silent and swift, a predator's grace. He kept his distance at first, assessing. The boy was painfully thin, his ribs visible even through the drab tunic he wore. His head was shaved, revealing a pale scalp crisscrossed with faint, silvery scars. More scars, old and new, littered his visible arms and legs. He was unconscious, his face slack, but etched with a deep, haunting exhaustion. The number 0 on his tunic was stark and clinical. This wasn't a lost hiker. This was a victim. Or a weapon. Or both. As Aizawa got closer, he noticed the faintest details. Strange, lightning bolt patterns, like Lichtenberg figures, seemed to be etched into the boy's skin, barely visible now that their glow had faded. The ground around the boy was also subtly warped. Blades of grass were twisted into impossible spirals, and a patch of moss had crystallized into a strange, blue-tinged substance. Kneeling down, Aizawa cautiously reached out a gloved hand, checking for a pulse. It was there, but it was thready and erratic. The boy's skin was cold, clammy. He was alive, but barely. This scene screamed of illegal human experimentation. A secret lab, a catastrophic failure, and a single survivor. It was a logical, if deeply disturbing, conclusion. Who was this boy? What had they done to him? And what was the power that could leave a scar like that on reality itself? Aizawa gently brushed a dirty strand of what was once green hair from the boy's forehead. The kid couldn't be more than 14 or 15. A child. He sighed, the sound barely audible in the preternatural quiet of the forest. This was far above his pay grade. This was a problem for Nizu for All Might. But right now, this was his problem. He activated his comms unit, his voice low and steady, betraying none of the deep unease he felt. This is Eraserhead. I've found the source of the disturbance. I need a secure medical evac to UA, highest priority. And notify Principal Nizu. He paused, looking from the glassy crater to the broken boy at his feet. We have a situation. A very, very complicated one. Consciousness returned not as a gentle dawn, but as a violent, stuttering boot-up sequence. The first sensation was a dull, rhythmic beeping, a sound too clean and steady for the chaos he had escaped. It was a clinical sound, the sound of machines that measured and monitored. The sound of a laboratory, panic, cold and absolute, was his first true thought. They found me. I didn't get away. I'm back. His eyes snapped open. The light was soft, indirect, a world away from the harsh fluorescent glare of the facility, but it was still white. The ceiling was white. The sheets covering him were white. He tried to bolt upright to run, but his body refused. No, it wasn't just his body. He was held down. Thick, padded restraints were strapped around his wrists, his ankles, and his chest. A raw, guttural cry of pure terror tore from his throat as he thrashed against the bonds. They were soft, much softer than the cold steel cuffs he was used to, but they were unyielding. He twisted and pulled, his gaunt muscles straining, but it was useless. He was caged again. The brief, intoxicating taste of freedom had been a hallucination, a final, cruel dream before being dragged back into hell. The beeping of the machine beside him sped up, its rhythm becoming frantic, a perfect mirror of his own hammering heart. The quiet thrum of wrongness was still there, a low-level vibration in his bones, a quiet chorus of whispers at the edge of his hearing. They were muted, like listening to a radio through a thick wall, but they were present. The monster was sleeping, not gone. Vessel integrity compromised. Stasis required observation. He squeezed his eyes shut, trying to block out the whispers, the beeping, the sterile white of the room. The smell was wrong. It wasn't the sharp, acidic tang of Hydra's antiseptics. This was cleaner, with a faint, almost sweet undertone. And the bed, it was soft. He couldn't remember the last time he had felt something soft. The cot in his cell had been a slab of hard polymer. The operating tables had been freezing metal. This was a real bed, with a real pillow and sheets. The small inconsistencies were just enough to sow a seed of confusion in the fertile ground of his panic. Where was he? He forced his eyes open again, slowly, trying to take in his surroundings. It was a medical room, clearly. Advanced, spotless. To his left was the heart monitor, its screen displaying his erratic pulse in a jagged green line. An IV drip was attached to a port in his arm, feeding a clear fluid into his veins. His body was no longer caked in dirt and blood, it had been cleaned. His shoulder, where the concussive slug had hit him, was bandaged, a dull ache emanating from beneath the gauze. He was still wearing a simple gown, but it was soft cotton, not the rough, scratchy tunic. There was no number stamped on the chest. His gaze drifted to the wall opposite his bed. It wasn't a wall. It was a massive pane of glass, dark and reflective. An observation window. And behind it, he could see them. Silhouettes. Figures watching him. The terror returned tenfold. He was an exhibit. A specimen on display. He stopped thrashing. A different kind of training took over, one born of a desperate need to survive. Be still. Be silent. Do not provoke. Do not give them a reason. He went limp against the restraints, his breathing shallow, his eyes wide and fixed on the dark glass, waiting for the Baron's voice to echo from a hidden speaker, to inform him of his failure, and the new agonies that awaited. His heart rate is dangerously elevated. He thinks he's been recaptured. Behind the one-way glass, in the darkened observation chamber, 3 figures stood watching the boy on the bed. The speaker was Recovery Girl. Her voice, usually so full of grandmotherly warmth, was strained with clinical concern. She held a data pad, its screen glowing with complex biological readings that made her frown deepen. Can you blame him, Chio? A deep, weary voice rumbled beside her. Toshinori Yagi, skeletal and gaunt, looked a shadow of his all-might persona. His fists were clenched at his sides, his hollowed eyes filled with a potent mixture of pity and guilt. Look at him. The scars, the brand. He's just a child. What kind of monsters would do this? The third figure, a small, white-furred creature in a sharp suit, said nothing for a moment, his black, beady eyes fixed on the boy with an unnerving intensity. Principal Niza of UA. Hai took a slow sip from his teacup. The kind that prioritize ideology over humanity, he said finally, his voice light but carrying an undercurrent of cold steel. The kind that see a person not as a soul, but as a tool. The file Shota recovered from the wreckage, though heavily corrupted, mentioned a Project Chimera. It seems we are looking at its sole success, or its most tragic failure. His condition is unlike anything I've ever encountered, Recovery Girl interjected, tapping her data pad. My quirk, it doesn't work on him. Not properly. Toshinori turned to her, his brow furrowed. What do you mean? It should be healing him, at the very least the wound on his shoulder. Oh, it tries, she said, frustration coloring her tone. When I use my quirk, I'm accelerating his body's natural healing process. But his body has no stable natural state. His cellular structure is in a constant, violent state of flux. It's simultaneously decaying and regenerating at a microscopic level, thousands of times per second. It's like his very atoms can't decide whether to exist or not. When I try to heal him, it's like trying to patch a ship that is actively unmaking its own hull. I can provide nutrients and support his base biological functions, which is what the 4 is for, but I can't fix the core problem. Because it's not an injury or a disease. It's his fundamental state of being now. Niza placed his teacup down with a soft click. A power that is not a quirk. An externally induced ability that his body was never meant to contain. The energy signature from the implosion site was exotic. It didn't match any known energy type on Earth. It behaved as if the laws of physics were optional suggestions. He looked at the trembling boy on the screen. They didn't just give him a power, they seemed to have turned him into a living, breathing paradox. It's both fascinating and utterly horrifying. We can't just leave him strapped to a bed like an animal, Toshinori insisted, his voice rising with emotion. He needs comfort. Reassurance. He needs to know he's safe. And who do you suggest provides that reassurance, Toshinori? Niza asked, his gaze unblinking. You, in your current form, are an unknown. And as All Might, your very presence is overwhelming, a symbol of power. To a boy who has been brutalized by power, you might be the most terrifying sight in the world. Chio is a doctor, a figure he has been conditioned to associate with pain. No, the first contact must be handled with extreme care. As if on cue, the door to the observation room slid open and Shota Aizawa entered, his usual tired expression carrying an extra weight of gravity. He glanced at the monitor, his eyes lingering on the boy's terrified, still form. He's awake, Aizawa stated, his voice a low monotone. He is, Niza confirmed. And he is, quite understandably, terrified. We were just discussing the best way to approach. Aizawa didn't hesitate. I'll do it. I'm the one who found him. I'm not a symbol of power like All Might, or a doctor. I'm just a man. A tired one at that. Maybe that'll be non-threatening enough. Toshinori looked like he was about to protest, but Nizu raised a paw. An excellent suggestion, Aizawa. Your quirk is also our only real failsafe if he has an episode. Be cautious. He is not a threat to be neutralized. He is a victim to be reached. Aizawa gave a curt nod. I know. He turned and walked towards the door leading into the medical room, pausing with his hand on the panel. Logical compassion. Got it. The door hissed open, and Aizawa stepped inside, leaving the others to watch in tense silence from behind the glass. The sound of the door sliding open made him flinch so hard the bed frame rattled. He squeezed his eyes shut, bracing for the inevitable. The heavy footsteps, the cold voice, the sting of a needle. But none of that came. He heard the door slide shut, and then, quiet. He dared to crack open an eyelid. A man was standing just inside the room, not moving closer. He was tall and scruffy, with dark, messy hair and a weary look on his face that seemed permanently etched there. He wore simple black clothes and had a strange, scarf-like object wrapped around his neck. He wasn't wearing a lab coat or tactical gear. He just looked tired. The man's eyes met his, and for a long moment either of them moved. The man's gaze wasn't cold like the Baron's, or filled with the detached curiosity of the technicians. It was just observant. Patient. Slowly, deliberately, the man pulled a simple chair away from the wall, the sound of its legs scraping softly on the polished floor. He didn't place it beside the bed, looming over him. He sat down a good 10 feet away, near the door, creating a space that felt less like an interrogation and more like a quiet vigil. The man didn't speak. He just sat there, his posture relaxed, his hands resting on his knees. Minutes stretched into an eternity. The frantic beeping of the heart monitor began to slow, the steady, non-threatening presence of the man slowly calming the storm in Izuku's chest. This was wrong. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. His captors were never patient. They were creatures of efficiency and purpose. This man was doing nothing. Finally, after what felt like hours, the man spoke. His voice was low, devoid of any sharp edges. The restraints are a precaution. We don't know what you can do, and you were unconscious. We can't have you accidentally hurting yourself or anyone else. He paused, letting the words sink in. We are not going to hurt you. You are in the medical wing of UA High School. UA? The name was a distant echo. A place from a storybook. The #1 hero's school in Japan. He dreamed of going there, once. In another life. It seemed impossible. A cruel joke. He remained silent, watching the man with wide, wary eyes. The man sighed, a sound of deep, profound exhaustion. You're dehydrated and your blood sugar is dangerously low, the man continued, his tone matter-of-fact. He pointed to a small tray on a rolling table near the wall. On it was a pitcher of water, a clean glass, and a small bowl of rice porridge. You need to eat. He still didn't move. The man seemed to understand. With slow, deliberate movements, he stood up, poured a glass of water, and walked it over. He didn't try to force it into his hand. He placed it on the bedside table, just within reach if he weren't restrained. Then he went back to his chair. Another long silence. The scent of the warm porridge was starting to reach him, and a deep, gnawing hunger made his stomach twist. He hadn't had real food he couldn't remember. Only nutrient paste, tasteless and gray, delivered through a slot in his cell door. He stared at the water. His throat was parchment. If I take off one of your restraints, the man said, are you going to try and run or fight? He just stared. Run where? Fight how? He was a broken thing. The man seemed to take his silence as an answer. He stood and approached the bed. Izuku flinched violently, a whimper escaping his lips as the man reached for the restraint on his right wrist. But the touch was surprisingly gentle. A quiet click, and the strap came loose. His hand was free. He stared at it, then back at the man, who had already retreated to his chair. It was a test. A gesture of trust. His arm felt unnaturally heavy. Slowly, tremulously, he reached for the glass of water. His fingers trembled so much he almost knocked it over. He brought it to his lips and drank. The water was cool and clean, and it was the most wonderful thing he had ever tasted. He drank it all, gasping for air when he was done, the simple act leaving him breathless. A flicker of something, approval, perhaps, crossed the man's face. Encouraged by the lack of any sudden moves, Izuku reached for the bowl of porridge. It was warm. He fumbled with the spoon, his motor skills clumsy from disuse and trauma. He brought a spoonful to his mouth. The taste was simple, rice, a hint of salt, but to him, it was a supernova of flavor. It was real. Tears welled in his eyes, unbidden, and began to trace paths down his hollowed cheeks. He ate, shoveling the food into his mouth with a desperate, pathetic hunger, not stopping until the bowl was empty. He set the bowl down, his breathing ragged, a strange mixture of relief and shame washing over him. The man had watched him the entire time, his expression unreadable. Do you have a name? The man asked, his voice still quiet, still calm. The question hit him like a physical blow. A name. His mind, a chaotic archive of pain, immediately supplied the designations. Subject 0. Vessel. Asset 1. The Chimera. Those were his names, the names of a thing. But the man had asked if he had a name. Not what he was called. He squeezed his eyes shut. He reached back, past the white rooms and the cold tables, past the Baron's voice and the screaming in his cells. He reached for a memory of a small apartment, the smell of katsudan, and a woman with kind green eyes and a worried smile. A woman holding his face in her hands. Izuku, my Izuku. The name was a shard of glass in his mind, beautiful and painful. To say it felt like a betrayal of the numb, silent creature he had become. It was an admission that there was still a person inside, a person who could be hurt. He opened his mouth, but only a dry, rasping sound came out. He hadn't spoken a real word in years. He swallowed, the simple porridge giving him just enough strength, just enough courage. He tried again. His voice was a ghost, a reedy, broken whisper. Midoriya. Izuku. The moment he said it, something shifted. It was like finding a single, solid rock in a landslide. An anchor. He was not Subject Zero. He was Izuku Midoriya. In the observation room, Toshinori let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. He remembers. Aizawa, on the other side of the glass, gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. Izuku, he repeated, testing the name. My name is Shota Aizawa. I'm a teacher here, a teacher. Not a doctor. Not a scientist. Not a guard. A teacher. The concept was so foreign, so alien, that Izuku couldn't process it. He had a name. He had a protector of a sort. A fragile, tentative sprout of hope began to unfurl in the barren wasteland of his heart. It was the most dangerous feeling he'd had all day. Toshinori couldn't stand it anymore. He saw the breakthrough, the first crack in the boy's shell. Aizawa had done wonderfully, but now the boy needed hope. He needed a symbol. He needed to know that the world he'd returned to had heroes in it. I'm going in, he said, already moving toward the door. Toshinori, wait. Recovery Girl warned. You don't know how he'll react. He just needs to see a friendly face, Toshinori insisted, his voice filled with a desperate, heroic conviction. He needs to know he's safe now. Truly safe. He didn't wait for Nisa's permission. He pushed through the door, his tall, skeletal frame filling the doorway. From his bed, Izuku saw the new figure enter. He was tall. So tall. Taller than Aizawa. His clothes hung loosely on a frame that was all sharp angles and jutting bones, but he held himself with an air of authority. An air of power. Izuku's breath hitched. The fragile calm Aizawa had built shattered like glass. The man's face was gaunt, his eyes shadowed, but he was trying to smile. A wide, reassuring smile. But all Izuku saw were the Baron's eyes, cold and calculating, above the sterile green mask. He saw the towering figures of the guards who dragged him from his cell. He saw power and authority coming to put him back in his place. You are an asset, the Baron's voice echoed in his head, a perfect, chilling memory. Your pain is data. Toshinori took a step into the room. Young man, he began, his voice soft, trying to be gentle. My name is Yagi Toshinori. I want you to know that you are. Get back, Izuku whispered, his voice trembling. His eyes were wide with a terror that went beyond fear of pain. It was the primal fear of a lab animal seeing the scientist's hand reaching into its cage. It's all right, son, Toshinori said, taking another step, holding out a placating hand. We're here to help you. That was the final trigger. The word help was what they always said before the agony began. No! The shriek was not of a boy, but of a cornered, wounded animal. The power inside him, the chaotic, screaming thing that Aizawa's quiet presence had soothed, erupted. It wasn't a wave of destruction. It was a violent lashing out of reality itself. The glass of water on his bedside table didn't shatter, it deconstructed, dissolving into a fine, sparkling mist that hung in the air for a second before vanishing. The heart monitor beside him went haywire, its screen flashing a dozen different colors before going dark with a pop. The lights in the ceiling flickered and sparked, and the very air in the room grew thick and heavy, crackling with an unseen energy. Problem child, stop. Aizawa was on his feet in an instant, his scarf, his capture weapon, unfurling around him. But Izuku couldn't stop. He was lost in the flashback, his mind trapped in a white room years ago. He was staring at Toshinori, but he was seeing the Baron. Get away from me! His eyes glowed with a faint, terrifying blue light. The force stand by his bed began to twist and warp, its metal groaning as its molecular bonds were forcibly rewritten. Aizawa's eyes flashed red. His hair levitated. Erasure. The effect was instantaneous and absolute. The blue glow in Izuku's eyes vanished. The crackling in the air ceased. The force stand froze in its half-twisted state. The chaotic power, which had been pouring out of Izuku like water from a burst dam, was violently and unnaturally slammed back inside him. The sensation was beyond pain. It was a cataclysmic, internal reversal. Imagine a supernova, but happening inside every single cell of your body. The unrestrained energy, denied an exit, turned inward, tearing at the already fragile seams of his existence. It was the force of a hurricane being stuffed back into a bottle in less than a second. Izuku's body arched off the bed, straining against the remaining restraints. A scream, high-pitched and horrifying, was ripped from his lungs. It was not a scream of terror. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated, physical agony. His veins stood out against his pale skin, and for a terrifying moment, the faint, fractal patterns beneath his skin glowed intensely, visible even without the power being active. Toshinori froze, his face a mask of horror. What's happening to him? My quirk doesn't get rid of his power, Aizawa grunted, his eyes strained as he held his gaze, refusing to blink. It suppresses it. It shoves it back down. For him, that must be excruciating. The scream finally died in Izuku's throat as his body went limp, his head lolling to the side. He wasn't unconscious, but he was lost in a sea of pain, his body twitching with the aftershocks. Tears and mucus streamed down his face, and a low, continuous moan escaped his lips. He was broken again. But this time, it was the heroes who had broken him. Aizawa finally blinked, and the pressure of his quirk released. Izuku just lay there, whimpering, a specimen once more, pinned to a bed not just by straps, but by his own monstrous, inescapable power. Toshinori stood frozen in the center of the room, the friendly smile gone, replaced by a look of profound, soul-crushing failure. He had wanted to offer the boy hope. Instead, he had become the monster under his bed and triggered an agony he couldn't have imagined. The question hung in the silent, tense room, heavier than any physical weight. How do you save a boy when the very act of reaching out to him becomes a weapon? The world had gone gray. After the agonizing episode, the violent suppression of his power that felt like being turned inside out, Izuku had retreated. He withdrew into a place in his mind he hadn't visited since the early years of his captivity. He called it the Gray. It was a silent, empty space, a buffer of emotional numbness he wrapped around himself like a shroud. In the Gray, the whispers at the edge of reality were muted, the constant thrum in his bones was a distant hum, and the memories of the Baron's cold eyes were locked behind a door with no key. He ate when food was brought. He slept when the lights were dimmed. He allowed the kind, elderly woman with the strange syringe cane to check his vitals, his eyes remaining unfocused, his body limp. He was the perfect specimen again, passive, compliant, and blessedly empty. The outburst had taught him a valuable lesson. Feeling, hope, terror, anger, was the flint that struck the spark. The Gray was a world without flint. The tired man, Aizawa, still came. He would sit in the chair by the door for an hour each day, sometimes reading a book, sometimes just staring into space. He rarely spoke, and when he did, it was simple statements. It's raining today. They're testing a new support item in ground beta. The food in the cafeteria is mediocre, as usual. He never asked questions. He never demanded a response. He was just there. A constant, non-threatening presence on the edge of Izuku's self-imposed void. Izuku was aware, on some level, that this was a kindness. A profound, patient gesture that he had done nothing to deserve. But kindness was a sharp object in his world. It threatened to pierce the Gray and let the screaming back in. So he remained empty, a ghost haunting a hospital bed, praying for the silence to last forever. He was so lost in his manufactured peace that he didn't register the door sliding open until two figures were already inside. One was Aizawa. The other was not a person. It was a small, white-furred creature, a mouse, a bear, a dog, in a pristine black suit. It walked on two legs, its beady black eyes fixing on him with an intelligence that was ancient and unnerving. It held a teacup in one paw. The sheer strangeness of the creature was a crack in his gray wall. Curiosity, an emotion he hadn't felt in a decade, flickered within him. He watched as the creature hopped effortlessly onto the chair Aizawa usually occupied, its movements precise and deliberate. This was not a casual visit. This was an evaluation. The specimen was being formally observed. Nise's office was a monument to organized thought. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves were filled with works on philosophy, quantum mechanics, and military strategy. A large shogi board sat in one corner, a game perpetually in progress. The wall behind his desk was a single pane of armored glass offering a panoramic view of UA's sprawling campus, a constant reminder of the world he was responsible for protecting. Today, that world felt profoundly fragile. "He can't stay here," Toshinori Yagi said, his voice strained. He paced the length of the window, his skeletal frame a stark silhouette against the bright morning. "Not in the main building. It's not safe for him, and it's not safe for the other students." "Chio, you saw what happened." Aizawa had to use his quirk, and the feedback nearly killed the boy. Recovery girl, seated in a plush armchair, sighed heavily. The boy's reaction was a textbook case of a catastrophic feedback loop. The energy, when denied an external outlet, ravaged his system on a cellular level. It's a miracle it didn't trigger widespread organ failure. Subjecting him to any more stress is, from a medical standpoint, grossly irresponsible. His system is the most unstable thing I have ever encountered. He's a lit fuse, and we have no idea how long it is, which is precisely why hiding him is not a solution, Shota Aizawa countered, his voice a low, gravelly counterpoint to Toshinori's emotional plea. He was leaning against a bookshelf, arms crossed, his expression as weary as ever. "We hide him in a quiet, isolated facility. We give him food, shelter, no stress. What happens in 5 years when he has a nightmare? What happens when a doctor he doesn't recognize tries to give him a flu shot?" The power lashed out because he was triggered by a perceived threat. You can't eliminate every potential trigger from a person's life. All you'd be doing is creating a more powerful bomb in a more remote location. "He is not a bomb, Aizawa. He is a boy," Toshinori snapped, whirling around. "A traumatized child who has suffered more than any of us can imagine. He deserves peace, a chance at a quiet life, far away from all of this. And you think Hydra will grant him that?" Aizawa retorted, his gaze unflinching. "They created him. They invested years, resources, who knows what else, into him. They're not just going to write him off as a loss. The moment he's moved to some quiet facility, he becomes a target. A much softer target than he is right here, inside the most secure fortress in Japan." "Aizawa is correct," Nisa said softly, not looking up from the teacup he was carefully inspecting. The quiet words cut through the tension in the room like a scalpel. "Hydra's operational doctrine is one of relentless asset reclamation. They will not stop. Hiding him is not protecting him, it is merely marinating him for recapture." Toshinori deflated, running a hand through his thinning blonde hair. "Then, what? A specialized institution? A government facility designed for people like him? Like him?" Aizawa scoffed. "There is no one like him. And what do you call a facility like that, All Might? It's a prison. A cage. We'd be doing exactly what his captors did, just with better amenities and a more sympathetic staff. We'd be reinforcing the deepest trauma he has, that he is a thing to be contained. You saw how he reacted when I first found him in that bed. He thought he was back there. Coddling him is a death sentence for his mind. Caging him is a death sentence for his soul." A heavy silence descended on the office. Toshinori looked defeated, Recovery Girl looked grim, and Aizawa looked tiredly resolute. They were at an impasse. Every logical path led to a dead end. Nisa finally placed his teacup down with a delicate click. He steepled his paws, his black eyes glinting. "You are all thinking in 2 dimensions, he said, his voice cheerful, a stark contrast to the grim atmosphere. "You see the boy as a static problem to be solved, a fragile object to be sheltered, or a dangerous one to be contained." He stood up on his chair, looking out the window at the students milling about on the grounds below. "But what if he is neither? What if he is a dynamic variable, an equation that needs to be understood before it can be solved?" He turned back to them, a strange, brilliant light in his eyes. "We cannot remove the power. We cannot contain the boy without breaking him. Therefore, the only logical path forward is to teach the boy to contain the power." Toshinori stared at him. "Teach him? How?" Who could possibly teach him how to control, whatever that is? We can, Nisa said simply. Here. At UA, recovery girl gasped. Nizu, you can't be serious. You want to put that child, in his condition, into the hero course? It is the single most logical, albeit radical, solution, Nisa declared, his voice ringing with unwavering certainty. He began to tick off the points on his pause. 1. Security. As Aizawa noted, UA is a fortress. Hydra would have to declare open war to get to him here. He is safer with us than anywhere else on the planet. 2. Staff. We have personnel uniquely equipped to handle him. Aizawa's erasure is our ultimate failsafe, our off switch, painful as it may be. The rest of our staff consists of pro-heroes accustomed to dealing with volatile and dangerous quirks. 3. Purpose. Right now, he is a victim. An object of pity and fear. He has no agency, no goal other than to not feel. Enrolling him, giving him a curriculum, a schedule, a purpose, it is the first step to rehumanizing him. It gives him a reason to get out of bed beyond simple biological necessity. 4. And this is the most crucial point, control. The hero course is, at its core, a high-pressure, high-stakes training ground for learning control. He will be forced to use his power in controlled, observable increments. To learn its limits, its costs, and its potential. He will not learn that by meditating in a quiet room. He will learn it by facing challenges, by failing, and by trying again, all under our direct supervision. He paused, letting his words sink in. We will be able to study this quantum flux. Understand it. Perhaps even find a way to mitigate its damage to his body. To do that, we need data. And we can only get that data by observing it in action. Toshinori looked horrified. You want to use him as a lab rat? No, Toshinori, Nisa said, his voice softening slightly. I want to treat him as a student. The difference is consent and purpose. We will not force him. We will offer him a path. A chance. His captors saw a blank slate and tried to write a weapon upon it. I see a boy who needs to learn how to write his own story, and I am offering him a pen and a safe place to practice. Aizawa, who had been listening intently, finally spoke. It's a devil's bargain, he said, his voice flat. We'd be asking a boy who is terrified of his own shadow to walk into the fire. We'd be putting him and everyone around him at risk. He pushed himself off the bookshelf. But it's the only plan that isn't a slow-motion execution. It's the only chance he has. A 1 in a million chance, but it's not zero. The room was silent again. The radical, terrifying logic of the plan was undeniable. It was a gamble of astronomical proportions, but the alternative was a certainty of failure. So, Nisa said, picking up his teacup again. We will make him the offer. The most important choice of his life. Aizawa, you have established a modicum of trust. You will come with me. We will present him with his only real option. We have a proposition for you, Midoriya Izuku, the creature, Nisa said, his voice clear and precise. It sent a shiver down Izuku's spine. No one but the Baron had ever used his full name. Aizawa remained by the door, his presence a silent, grounding weight. As you are now, Nisa continued, you are a danger to yourself and others. Your power, this quantum flux as your creators called it, is untamed. It is eroding your body and is prone to outbursts. Correct? Izuku flinched but said nothing. He just wanted to sink back into the gray. There are 2 options for your future, Nisa went on, his tone as matter-of-fact as a doctor diagnosing a terminal illness. Option A, we place you in a secure, long-term care facility. You will be safe, fed, and monitored. You will live a quiet, stress-free, and utterly empty life, waiting for the day your power inevitably consumes you from within, or for your former captors to reclaim you. You will remain a specimen in a cage, albeit a gilded one. Izuku's heart hammered against his ribs. A cage. He knew it. Then, Nisa said, leaning forward slightly, there is option B. A path of great risk, great pain, and uncertain outcome. A path that offers not a guarantee of success, but a possibility of it. He paused, his black eyes seeming to pierce right through Izuku's carefully constructed numbness. We would like to offer you a place here, at UA High. As a student in the Hero course, Class 1A. The words hit Izuku with the force of a physical blow. The gray shattered. The whispers roared back into his head, a tidal wave of quantum noise. The thrumming in his bones intensified, a painful vibration that shook his very soul. Hero, weapon, control, order. No, he whispered, the words scraping his throat. He started to shake, his eyes wide with horror. No, you don't understand. We understand that you are scared, Aizawa said, his voice cutting through the noise in Izuku's head. Scared? Izuku's voice cracked, rising in pitch. I'm not scared. I'm a monster. A weapon. That's what they made me to be. He looked down at his own hands, seeing not flesh and bone, but the instruments that had erased men from existence. This power, it only destroys. It only hurts. He looked up at them, his eyes wild with desperation. I don't want to be a hero. I just want it to stop. Can't you just take it out? Please? I don't care what it costs. Just cut it out of me. The raw desperation in his voice, the plea to be mutilated just to be free, hung in the air, raw and painful. Nisa's expression softened into something resembling pity. My boy, if it were that simple, we would have already done so. It is not a tumor to be excised. It is woven into the fabric of your being. It is you, and you are it. We cannot remove it. Then let me go to the facility, Izuku begged, tears starting to stream down his face. Let me go where I can't hurt anyone. I'll be quiet. I'll be good. I won't cause any trouble. Please, just put me somewhere I can't break anything else. That is not a life, Midoriya, Aizawa said bluntly. That is a slow suicide. You would be choosing to let the power win. It already won. Izuku sobbed, curling in on himself. It won the day they put it in me. The conversation was going in circles. The boy was too trapped in his trauma, too convinced of his own monstrosity, to see the logic they were presenting. They needed something to shift his perspective. As if summoned by the sheer dramatic tension in the room, a faint smell of ozone began to permeate the air. A series of sharp crackles drew their attention to the corner of the room. A multifunction diagnostic monitor, one of the few machines to have survived Izuku's last outburst, began to smoke. It had been damaged, its internal wiring frayed. Now a short circuit was occurring. Sparks showered from the back of the machine onto the linoleum floor. A thin curtain, hung for privacy, was just inches away. Before anyone could react, a spark leaped, and the synthetic fabric of the curtain caught. A small, angry orange flame erupted, climbing the curtain with terrifying speed. Fire! Recovery Girl's voice squawked from an intercom near the bed, having been monitoring from her office. Aizawa, the extinguisher is by the door. Aizawa was already moving, but the flames were spreading fast, licking at the ceiling tiles, thick black smoke beginning to pour into the room. But someone else was moving faster. Izuku didn't think. He didn't reason. He didn't weigh the cost. He saw the fire. He saw Aizawa, the tired man who had sat with him in silence. He saw the strange creature, Nizu, who for all his unnerving intelligence, was small and flammable. He saw the room he was in, a place that, for all its terror, had been the first safe place he'd known in years. Danger. Threat. Protect. The instinct was absolute, overriding every rational thought, every ounce of fear and self-loathing. He threw his free hand forward, his palm open towards the blaze. The power answered his call, but this time, it was different. He didn't push his rage or his terror into it. He focused on a single, clear concept: emptiness. The air between him and the fire shimmered, buckling like a road on a hot day. There was no explosion, no wave of force. Instead, there was a soft, implosive whoosh, like a giant's sigh. A perfect, invisible sphere of warp space materialized around the burning curtain. Inside the sphere, the fire was snuffed out as if it had never been. The oxygen, the heat, the very medium in which it existed was momentarily erased from reality. The flames vanished, leaving behind a blackened, smoldering curtain, and a room suddenly plunged back into silence. The sphere of warp space dissipated, the air rushing back in to fill the void. The effort, as focused as it was, still took its toll. A spike of pure agony lanced through Izuku's skull. He gasped, his vision swimming with black spots, and he instinctively clutched his head, a low moan escaping his lips. His nose began to bleed, a single, crimson drop falling onto the white sheet. A familiar price, but a price he had paid willingly. A price he had paid to protect. A stunned silence filled the room. Aizawa had frozen halfway to the fire extinguisher. Nizu was staring, his teacup forgotten, his beady eyes wide. Recovery Girl was silent on the intercom. They all stared at Izuku. At the boy who claimed to be a monster, who believed his power could only destroy. The boy who had just used his reality-breaking, world-ending curse to perfectly and precisely snuff out a small fire. Aizawa was the first to move. He walked back from the extinguisher and stood over Izuku's bed, looking down at the boy who was now trembling from the pain and the backlash. His voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of an unbreakable truth. That's why, he said. Izuku looked up, confused, blood trickling from his nose, his head throbbing. You say your power only destroys, Aizawa continued, his gaze intense. You just used it to save. You didn't think. You didn't hesitate. Your first, deepest instinct was to protect. That instinct, problem child, that is the heart of a hero. He leaned in closer. The power is a storm inside you, and right now, it's raging. Hiding from it will just let it flood everything. You have to learn to command the winds. You have to become the eye of your own hurricane. He stood up straight, his words echoing in the silent room, a final, undeniable ultimatum. You can't get rid of the power. So you have to learn to command it. Otherwise it will command you. For the rest of your very short life. Izuku stared at his own trembling hand, still outstretched. It was a source of immense pain, a curse branded onto his soul. But he had just used it. He had used it, and it had worked. It had done something good. The action and the result were completely at odds with everything he believed about himself. Aizawa was right. The power wasn't going away. It was a part of him. He could either spend the rest of his life cowering in a gray room, waiting for it to consume him, or he could face it. He could fight it. He could try to tame the monster, the path of a hero. It was a terrifying, insane prospect. It meant more pain, more risk, more chances to lose control and hurt people. But it was also the only path that wasn't a surrender. It was the only path that offered a sliver of a chance to be something other than Subject Zero. To be Izuku Midoriya, the devil's bargain. The 1 in a million chance. He looked from his hand to Aizawa's stern, tired face, and then to Nizu's patient, expectant one. His entire future balanced on the edge of a single word. He took a shaky breath, the coppery taste of blood on his tongue. His voice was barely a whisper, a sound of pure, terrified acceptance. Okay. The entrance exam was not a chaotic battlefield teeming with aspiring heroes and rampaging robots. For Izuku Midoriya, it was a sterile, silent chamber of judgment. He stood at the entrance to UA's training ground Gamma, a vast, indoor facility that looked less like a hero's playground and more like a scientist's cruel maze. The walls were stark white, grid with dark lines. The floor was a smooth, metallic composite. There were no buildings to smash, no faux cityscape to navigate. There were only platforms of varying heights, chasms of indeterminate depth, moving walls, and the ominous, silent snouts of projectile launchers. It was an abstract landscape, a place designed to test not strength, but precision. Izuku's hands, clad in a pair of simple black fingerless gloves Aizawa had given him, were trembling. He wore a standard UA tracksuit, but on his gaunt frame, it looked 2 sizes too big, a borrowed skin he didn't feel worthy of. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the low, oppressive thrum of the power humming in his bones. The whispers were there, a constant chorus at the edge of his hearing, speaking of probabilities and vectors, of the million ways he could fail. Structural integrity of Platform 7B is 98.4%. Trajectory analysis of Launcher C indicates non-lethal kinetic rounds. Probability of catastrophic power failure, 12.7% and rising. Shut up, he breathed, the words a faint puff of mist in the cool air. He squeezed his eyes shut, trying to force the analytical torrent back into its box. He had to focus. In the observation booth high above, Principal Nizu watched the boy's trembling form on a high-definition monitor, a fresh cup of jasmine tea steaming beside him. His anxiety is palpable, he noted, his tone cheerful. A perfectly natural response. This is the first time we have requested he use his abilities in a non-emergency context. It is a significant psychological hurdle. Shota Aizawa stood beside him, arms crossed, his gaze fixed on the screen with an intensity that bordered on paternal dread. He's not ready for this. On the contrary, Niza countered, taking a delicate sip of his tea. He will never be ready. Readiness is a luxury his condition does not afford. What we need to see is not readiness, but potential for control. Raw power is a blunt instrument. We already know he has an abundance of that. Niza gestured to another screen displaying a satellite image of the glassy crater where the Hydra lab used to be. What we need to ascertain is whether or not he can learn to be a scalpel. Recovery girl, observing from a medical monitoring station, chimed in. His vitals are already elevated. Cortisol levels are through the roof. Be ready to call it off, Shota. Another feedback loop like the one in the infirmary could cause permanent neurological damage. I know, Aizawa said, his knuckles white where he gripped his own arm. Through the intercom, his voice crackled, devoid of any of the tension he felt. Midoriya, your objective is to reach the finish line on the far side of the arena. There are 3 stages. You are being scored on efficiency and control, not speed or destruction. Rescue points are not a factor. Understood? Izuka flinched at the sound of his name but managed a jerky nod. Control. Not destruction. The words were a mantra, a prayer. Stage 1 begins now, Aizawa's voice announced. A section of the floor in front of Izuku retracted with a smooth hiss, revealing a 50-foot chasm. On the other side was the next platform. It was a simple test. A jump for someone with a mobility quirk. A puzzle for someone without. For Izuku, it was a tightrope walk over an abyss of his own making. He took a deep, shaky breath. He could try to find another way around, but that wasn't the point. They wanted to see him use the power. He focused on the spot directly across from him. He didn't think about the distance. He thought about the destination. He closed his eyes and summoned the sick, lurching feeling of dislocation, the sensation of reality tearing. He blinked. For a fraction of a second, the world dissolved into a nauseating smear of non-color and non-sound. He was a packet of information being sent from one point to another. Then, with a violent jolt, reality reasserted itself. He was on the other side, stumbling forward, his stomach churning. He caught himself before he fell, gasping for air. The short hop had left him feeling like he'd just run a marathon. A single, warm trickle of blood dripped from his nose and spattered onto the white floor. He quickly wiped it away with the back of his glove. Minimal spatial displacement, Niza murmured, watching the telemetry. Localized tear lasted only 0.08 seconds. The energy expenditure was still disproportionately high, but it was contained. Promising. Aizawa just grunted, his eyes never leaving the boy. As Izuku straightened up, a section of the wall to his right slid open, revealing stage 2. It was a narrow corridor, but the far end was blocked by a thick, reinforced wall. To the right of the wall, protected by a transparent blast shield, was a single red button. The path forward was blocked, but the way to open it was visible. He understood immediately. He couldn't go around. He couldn't go through the blast shield. He had to go through the wall. His heart sank. Phasing was intimate. It was a violation of the natural order that felt profoundly wrong. When he phased, he had to actively hold his own atoms together, to convince them not to fly apart in the face of non-existence. The risk of miscalculation, of rematerializing inside the solid matter, was a nightmare that had kept him awake many nights in his cell. He approached the wall, placing a hand on its cold, smooth surface. He could feel the dense molecular structure of the steel alloy. He closed his eyes, focusing on the space behind the wall, on the red button. He didn't want to phase his whole body, just his arm. A smaller piece, a smaller risk. Be nothing. Then be something again. He pushed his hand forward. The resistance vanished. A wave of vertigo washed over him as his hand and forearm became insubstantial, sinking into the metal. It was a deeply unsettling feeling, like plunging your arm into static. On the other side, his fingers, ghost-like and shimmering, fumbled in the air before finding the button. He pressed it. A loud buzz echoed through the chamber, and the wall in front of him retracted into the ceiling. He pulled his arm back, a sharp gasp escaping his lips as sensation flooded back into the nerves. It felt like plunging his arm into a bucket of ice and fire. He cradled his arm to his chest, his head throbbing with the beginnings of a migraine. The wall where his arm had passed through now bore a faint, shimmering afterimage, the metal groaning softly as its compromised molecules settled. Impressive, Recovery Girl admitted, her eyes wide. The level of fine control to phase a single limb without destabilizing the rest of his body, it's remarkable. But look at his biometrics. His neural activity is spiking. That can't be painless. The final stage was ahead. A long, straight path to the finish line. As he started to walk, a series of clicks echoed from the walls. The projectile launchers. Thwump. 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 They didn't fire bullets. They fired heavy, rubber balls at high velocity. They wouldn't kill him, but they would hurt. They would knock him off his feet. The first one came straight at him. Instinct took over. He didn't have time to blink or phase. A desperate, protective impulse surged, and he threw up a hand. The air in front of him shimmered, bending like a lens. The rubber ball, instead of hitting him, curved in an impossible arc around the distortion and slammed into the wall behind him. Another ball came from the side. He created another warp, smaller this time, deflecting it. And another. And another. He was a frantic conductor orchestrating a symphony of silent, invisible shields. Each one was a drain. Each one sent a fresh wave of dizziness through him. His movements became sluggish, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The migraine was a physical hammer pounding inside his skull. His vision started to blur at the edges. He deflected a final projectile and staggered, falling to one knee. The launchers fell silent. The path was clear. The finish line was only 30 feet away. He could just blink. One final, tiny jump and it would be over. The thought was overwhelmingly tempting. Final instruction, Midoriya. Aizawa's voice came over the intercom, softer this time. Walk. Izuku looked up, his vision swimming. He saw the finish line. He saw the temptation. And he understood. The final test wasn't about using his power. It was about not using it. It was about restraint when he was at his weakest, when the shortcut was the most alluring. Gritting his teeth, he pushed himself to his feet. Every muscle screamed. His head felt like it was about to split open. He put one foot in front of the other. The 30 feet felt like a mile. It was the hardest thing he had done all day. He finally stumbled across the finish line, a painted red stripe on the floor. And the moment he was across, his legs gave out completely. His consciousness dissolved into a swirling gray fog, and he collapsed onto the cold floor, the trial finally over. In the booth, Aizawa was already moving toward the door. Get the gurney, he said to Recovery Girl. Mizu watched the boy's still form on the monitor, a thoughtful expression on his face. He passed, he said, more to himself than to anyone else. Not with flying colors. Not with heroic bravado, but with pain, and with restraint. He took a final sip of his tea. Yes. He will do. At the exact same time, in Training Ground Beta, the world was exploding. Katsuki Bakugo was a whirlwind of fire and fury. He rocketed through the faux cityscape, propelled by controlled detonations from his palms. A one-point robot appeared around a corner. Bakugo didn't even break stride. AP shot! He roared, focusing his explosion into a concentrated, armor-piercing blast that blew a smoking hole straight through the robot's torso. He was magnificent. A force of nature. His power was an extension of his will, a perfect expression of his aggressive, overwhelming confidence. The other applicants scrambled for points, taking down robots with a chaotic mix of quirks. Bakugo saw them as nuisances, obstacles in his path to absolute victory. Out of my way, extras! He saw a group of students struggling with a massive 3-point robot. With a battle cry, he launched himself into the air, spun, and unleashed a massive explosion that engulfed the machine, melting its armor and frying its circuits. He landed in a crouch as the behemoth crashed to the ground behind him, not even bothering to look back. He was fast. He was powerful. He was strategic. He was everything a hero was supposed to be. When the dust settled and the final buzzer sounded, Bakugo stood panting in a field of robotic wreckage, smoke rising from his gauntlets. A grin, sharp and predatory, split his face. There was no doubt. He was number one. Later, standing before the giant screen displaying the results, his grin widened. First, Katsuki Bakugo 77 villain points, 25 rescue points. Total, 102. He had crushed it. Utterly and completely. He'd even gotten rescue points, though he couldn't remember consciously saving anyone. Probably just got them by default for blowing up a robot that was about to attack some weakling. It didn't matter. The score was a confirmation of what he already knew: he was the best. He was destined for the top, and this was just the first, obvious step. As he swaggered out of the UA gates, basking in the glow of his triumph, a flicker of movement caught his eye. A UA staff car was pulling away from a private entrance, the kind reserved for faculty and important guests. Standing near the curb was the pro hero, Eraserhead, looking as bored and exhausted as he did on TV. Bakugo's eyes widened. Eraserhead himself. He was about to march over and declare his intention to surpass him, but then he saw who the hero was with. He was a boy, about Bakugo's age, looking pale and half-dead. He was rail-thin, with a shaved head that showed off a web of silvery scars on his scalp. He was being helped into the car by Eraserhead, his movements slow and pained. Bakugo's brain stalled. His smug superiority evaporated, replaced by a cold, prickling sense of profound confusion. He knew that face. Even without the wild green hair, even with the haunted, hollowed-out look in the eyes, he knew that face. Freckles. A round face. A jaw that was perpetually set in a state of timid apprehension. Deku. It was impossible. It couldn't be. Izuku Midoriya, the useless, quirkless, sniveling crybaby from his childhood, had vanished without a trace almost 6 years ago. One day he was there, mumbling in his notebook and getting underfoot, and the next, he was gone. His mom had moved away. The official story was that they'd relocated for a family emergency. Bakugo hadn't cared. It was a relief. One less pebble in his shoe. And now, here he was, being personally escorted by a top pro hero at UA High. Looking like he'd been through a war. The car door closed, and the vehicle pulled away, leaving Bakugo standing on the sidewalk, his mind reeling. How? Why was he here? What the hell was that look on his face? And why was a pro hero treating him like he was made of glass? Deku was a zero. A blank. The absolute bottom of the food chain, the foundation upon which Bakugo had built his own sense of superiority. The carefully ordered world inside Katsuki Bakugo's head, where he was the undisputed peak and Deku was the worthless valley, suddenly tilted on its axis. A seed of doubt, cold and unwelcome, began to sprout in the fertile ground of his arrogance. How the hell did Deku get into UA? The first day of class at UA High was electric. The room buzzed with the excited chatter of the best and brightest of their generation. A tall boy with glasses and engines in his calves chopped his arms with rigid formality. A girl with pink skin and horns laughed with a boy who had spiky red hair. A floating uniform drifted through the aisles. It was a vibrant, chaotic ecosystem of power and potential, and in the back corner there was a black hole. Izuku Midoriya sat at the rearmost desk by the window, a position he had chosen instinctively. It offered the best vantage point of the room and a clear view of the only exit. He made himself small, his shoulders hunched, his head down. He stared at the polished surface of his desk, trying to become one with the furniture. He was a ghost at the feast. His tracksuit felt like a costume. He didn't belong here. These were the prodigies, the elite. They shone with a confidence and an inner light he couldn't comprehend. He was a faulty experiment, a broken weapon hiding amongst real heroes. His presence did not go unnoticed. He was an anomaly. His scarred scalp and the haunted, distant look in his eyes set him apart. The other students threw curious, wary glances his way. They whispered amongst themselves, "Who's that guy?" Mina Ashido whispered to Kirishima. "He looks kinda intense." "I don't know, but he gives me the shivers," Kaminari added. "Did you see the scars on his head?" Bakugo sat several rows ahead, his back ramrod straight. He hadn't looked back once, but he could feel Deku's presence like a bad itch. The impossible was real. The useless waste of space was in his class. He seethed, the confusion from the exam day curdling into a hot, simmering rage. Then, a shadow fell over Izuku's desk. He looked up, his guard instantly raised. A girl with a round, cheerful face and big, brown eyes was smiling down at him. A genuine, unguarded smile. It was the girl he'd seen floating earlier. "Hi," she said, her voice bright and bubbly. "I'm Ochiko Uraraka. It's nice to meet you. This is so nerve-wracking, isn't it? I was so worried during the exam, but I'm glad we all made it." Her kindness was a physical force. It was so pure, so uncomplicated, that Izuku's traumatized mind had no category for it. An approach meant one of three things: an order, an evaluation, or an attack. This friendly, open gesture was a foreign language. His programming short-circuited. His reaction was not mental, but physiological. A deep, primal instinct screamed danger. Unknown variable. Threat. He flinched. It wasn't a small twitch. He physically recoiled, pressing himself back into his chair so hard the legs scraped against the floor. His eyes went wide with alarm, and he brought his hands up in a defensive posture, as if warding off a blow. A choked, panicked sound caught in his throat. Uraraka's smile faltered. Her hand, which she had half extended, dropped to her side. She looked stunned, then hurt. "Oh. I'm sorry," she stammered, taking a step back. "I didn't mean to startle you." The entire class, which had been buzzing with conversation, fell silent. Everyone turned to look. They saw Uraraka's bewildered face and Izuku's terrified, defensive posture. They saw a boy who reacted to a friendly greeting as if he'd just been stabbed. The ghost in the corner was not just quiet. He was broken. Shame, hot and sharp, pierced through Izuku's panic. He lowered his hands, looking down at his desk, his face burning. He had hurt her. He hadn't meant to. He just couldn't control the reaction. "If you're here to make friends, then you can pack up and leave." The voice, dry and bored, cut through the awkward silence. Aizawa was at the front of the classroom, standing there as if he'd materialized from the shadows. He was holding a sleeping bag. The class instantly straightened up. Aizawa's eyes swept across the room, taking in the scene. His gaze lingered for a fraction of a second on Izuku, a flicker of something unreadable in their depths: concern, understanding, frustration, before moving on. It was a silent, private check-in. "Are you okay?" the look asked. Izuku gave the slightest, almost imperceptible shake of his head. "No." Aizawa's gaze hardened as he addressed the class. "It took you 8 seconds to quiet down. That's not going to work. Time is a precious resource." He unzipped his sleeping bag and pulled out a UA gym uniform. "Put these on and meet me on the field." Now, as the students scrambled to obey, the tension broke. But the image remained seared into the minds of Class 1A, the cheerful girl and the broken boy who flinched away from her kindness. The anomaly in their system had a name, but for now, all they knew was the deep, unsettling chasm that separated him from the rest of them. The pea grounds of UA High baked under the morning sun. The air was thick with the scent of cut grass and the nervous energy of 20 superpowered teenagers. They stood in a loose, uncomfortable cluster, all clad in their new blue and white gym uniforms. Izuku stood at the very edge of the group, a satellite in a distant, lonely orbit. The uniform felt foreign, the fabric clinging to his too thin frame. He kept his gaze fixed on the ground, tracing the chalk lines of the running track with his eyes, trying to build a new wall of gray around himself. Uraraka's hurt expression was burned into his memory, a fresh brand on his psyche. He was a creature of sharp edges, a hazard. The further he stayed from them, the safer they would be. A quirk assessment test? The class murmured collectively. But what about orientation? And the welcoming ceremony? Uraraka asked, her voice laced with a confusion that was echoed on the faces of her classmates. Aizawa turned to face them, his expression a mask of profound indifference. If you're going to become heroes, you don't have time for pointless pleasantries. UA is not a normal school. Our freestyle approach extends to our teachers as well. His eyes, dark and tired, swept across their faces. You've been using your quirk since you were kids, but you've been held back by rules, regulations. You've never been allowed to truly cut loose. Here you will. He tossed the softball to Bakugo, who caught it with a smirk. Bakugo. You finished first in the practical exam. What was your best softball throw in junior high? 67 meters, Bakugo said, his voice dripping with arrogance as he hefted the ball. Try it with your quirk, Aizawa instructed, gesturing to a large white circle drawn on the ground. Do whatever you need to. Just stay in the circle. Bakugo's smirk widened into a predatory grin. This was his stage. He strode into the circle, stretched his arms, and then reared back. The other students watched with a mixture of awe and apprehension. Daithai! He screamed, the word tearing through the quiet morning. As his hand swung forward, a massive, concussive explosion erupted from his palm. The softball became a cannonball, propelled by a plume of fire and smoke. It shot into the sky, a tiny white speck against the brilliant blue, arcing higher and further than any normal throw could ever hope to achieve. The shockwave from the blast washed over the students, making them stagger. Aizawa held up a small device. A moment later it beeped. He turned the screen to the class. 705.2 meters. The students gasped. Whoa, 705 meters? Seriously? Kaminari exclaimed. That's the power of a hero. Kirishima yelled, his eyes sparkling. This is gonna be awesome. Awesome, you say? Aizawa's voice was suddenly cold, all traces of permissiveness gone. The air grew heavy. You think this is a game? You have 3 years here to become a hero. You think you can spend it having fun? His lips curled into a humorless smile that was more terrifying than a frown. All right. New rule. The student who scores lowest in total points across all 8 tests will be judged to have no potential. He paused, letting the weight of his next words crush them. And will be expelled immediately. Panic rippled through the students. This wasn't a game. This was a culling. Their dreams, their futures, were suddenly on the line. Izuku felt a different kind of panic. Expelled? The thought should have been a relief. Expulsion meant being sent away, back to a quiet facility, back to the safety of a cage. But Nisa's words echoed in his head, a slow suicide. And Aizawa's, it's the only chance he has. He had made a choice. He had accepted the devil's bargain. To be expelled now was to be cast back into the abyss. But how could he compete? His power wasn't for throwing balls or running fast. It was for breaking things. For unmaking reality. Every use was a sip of poison. How could he ration it across 8 tests without destroying himself or failing completely? The first test was the 50-meter dash. Izuku watched as Ida Tenya, the tall boy with engines in his legs, exploded off the starting line, covering the distance in an astonishing 3.04 seconds. Uraraka, using her quirk to lighten her clothes and shoes, managed a respectable 7.15 seconds. When it was Izuku's turn, he stood at the starting line, his heart pounding. He could blink. A single, short-range teleport would give him an unbeatable time. But the cost, a nosebleed, a spike of pain, for a simple sprint? Aizawa was watching him, his expression unreadable. Control. Not destruction. He made a decision. He ran. He ran with his own 2 legs, his muscles weak and atrophied from years of confinement. His form was sloppy, his breathing ragged. He was pathetically slow. The timer beeped as he crossed the finish line, gasping for air. 8.52 seconds. It was one of the worst scores. He heard a few snickers from the crowd. He didn't look at them. He just walked back to the edge of the group, his face burning with shame. The second test, grip strength. He took the dynamometer in his hand. His fingers were long and thin, with none of the built-up muscle of his peers. He squeezed as hard as he could, his knuckles white with effort. The device barely registered the pressure. 26 kilograms. Bakugo, standing nearby, scoffed audibly. Pathetic. Izuku flinched but didn't react. He was already dead last. The chasm between him and the others was growing wider with every test. Standing long jump, sit-ups, side-to-side steps, he failed them all spectacularly. He performed like a normal, out-of-shape, quirkless boy. Because that's what he was, without his curse. He could feel the stares of his classmates, the mixture of pity and contempt. He could feel Bakugo's glare, a physical weight of confusion and burning rage on the back of his neck. He's not using a quirk. The thought was a virus spreading through the class. Did he lie to get in? Is he really quirkless? Aizawa watched it all unfold, his face impassive. He saw the pitiful scores. He saw the boy's mounting desperation, and he saw the internal struggle, the hand that kept twitching as if wanting to call on the power, only to be forced down by sheer will. This was part of the test too. The psychological pressure. Finally, it was time for the last event. The ball throw. Izuku stepped into the circle, his mind a maelstrom of failure and fear. He was going to be expelled. After everything, the escape, the terror, the fragile spark of hope, he was going to fail on the very first day. He looked at Aizawa, a desperate, pleading look in his eyes. I can't do this. Aizawa's expression didn't change. He just nodded slightly, a silent command. Show me. Izuku looked down at the softball in his hand. It felt impossibly heavy. He didn't have Bakugo's explosive power or Uraraka's gravity control. He couldn't throw it. But I don't have to throw it. A cold, logical whisper, the voice of the chimera, cut through his panic. The objective is distance. The method is irrelevant. Displacement is the most efficient form of distance. He knew what it was suggesting. Not to propel the ball, but to move it. To erase it from one point in space-time and have it reappear in another. A long-range blink. It was an idea he had never even considered. The further the blink, the greater the strain, the higher the risk. To blink something across miles. He didn't know if he could survive it, but what other choice did he have? He took a deep breath, the air tasting of ozone. He held the ball in his open palm, his fingers trembling. He closed his eyes and focused, not on the ball itself, but on the idea of the ball, its mass, its shape, its position in the universe. He reached out with his power, a delicate, terrifying tendril of warped reality, and wrapped it around the object. The softball began to glow. A faint, ethereal blue light pulsed from it, casting strange shadows on Izuku's face. The air around his hand grew cold, and a low hum vibrated from the ball, a sound that seemed to exist just at the edge of hearing. What's he doing? Someone whispered. Is that his quirk? Izuku ignored them. He focused his will, pouring every ounce of his concentration into the task. He didn't picture a destination. He couldn't. He didn't know the world well enough. Instead, he gave the power a simple, abstract command. Away. As far as possible. He pushed. The ball did not fly. It did not explode. It simply vanished. One moment it was there, a glowing blue sphere in his palm. The next, it was gone. Not a sound, not a flash of light, just an instantaneous absence. The blue glow around his hand faded, and he staggered, a sharp gasp escaping his lips. A wave of vertigo washed over him, so intense he had to grip his knees to keep from collapsing. A fresh, thick stream of blood poured from his nose. The migraine that had been a dull throb was now a blinding, white-hot agony. The class stared in stunned silence. The ball was gone. Just gone. Where did it go? All eyes turned to Aizawa, who was staring at the device in his hand. His eternally bored expression had been replaced by one of wide-eyed disbelief. The screen wasn't showing a number. It was displaying a single, stark symbol, blinking over and over. Infinity. Infinity? Ida exclaimed, his voice incredulous. What does that mean? How is that possible? It didn't travel a measurable distance, Aizawa said, his voice low, almost to himself. He looked from the device to Izuku, who was swaying on his feet, blood dripping onto the ground. The GPS tracker inside the ball, its signal ceased to exist at this location and simultaneously reappeared outside the sensor range. It didn't travel the space between. It just jumped. He lowered the device, his mind struggling to process the implications. The boy hadn't thrown the ball. He had erased it from UA and pasted it somewhere else on the planet. The sheer, casual violation of physics was breathtaking. He looked at Izuku, at the pain etched on his face, the blood, the trembling. And he understood. The infinity symbol wasn't a score. It was a warning label, a measure of the horrifying, limitless potential simmering inside this broken child. Aizawa cleared his throat, regaining his composure. Alright, that's the last test. I'll post the final scores in the classroom. He turned and began to walk away, leaving the students to stare at Izuku, the boy who had scored 0 on everything and infinity on 1. The anomaly. The ghost in their system. The locker room was a cacophony of noise, showers running, lockers slamming, students chattering excitedly about the day's results. Izuku dressed in a silent corner, his movements slow and pained. His head felt like it was full of shattered glass. He could feel the curious stares of his classmates, but no one approached him. He was a puzzle they couldn't solve, a question mark they were afraid to ask. He finished dressing and started to leave, wanting nothing more than to crawl into his bed in the empty dorm room he'd been assigned. But a hand, hot and heavy, clamped down on his shoulder, spinning him around. He was slammed back against a row of metal lockers with a deafening clang that reverberated through his skull. Towering over him, his face a mask of incandescent fury, was Katsuki Bakugo. "Where the hell were you, Deku?" Bakugo snarled, his voice a low, dangerous growl. His crimson eyes were burning with a mixture of rage, confusion, and something else, something that looked almost like fear. "You disappear for 6 years, and then you show up here? At UA? Looking like that?" He gestured vaguely at Izuku's scarred scalp and gaunt frame. Izuku flinched, his back pressed hard against the cold metal. The grip on his shoulder was crushing. "And what the hell was that?" Bakugo demanded, his voice rising. "That thing with the ball? You're quirkless. A useless pebble on the side of the road. You're not supposed to have a quirk. So what the fuck was that?" The aggression, the shouting, the raw, explosive anger, it was all too familiar. Bakugo's furious face began to blur, to distort. The spiky blonde hair, the enraged red eyes, they melted away, replaced by a memory, sharp and cold as a scalpel, a sterile green mask. Eyes like chips of ice. A voice, cultured and cruel. "You are an asset. Your pain is data. Your defiance is an anomaly to be corrected." The Baron. Izuku wasn't in a locker room at UA anymore. He was back in the White Room, strapped to a table, the smell of antiseptic filling his nostrils. The man pinning him down was not a childhood rival. He was his tormentor, his creator. The panic that had been simmering all day erupted. The gray walls shattered, and the screaming inside him returned, a deafening, all-consuming roar. "Get away from me," he whispered, his voice trembling, his eyes wide with a terror that Bakugo couldn't possibly understand. He was no longer seeing Bakugo. He was seeing a monster from his past. Bakugo, misinterpreting the fear as the old, familiar terror he used to inspire in Deku, pressed his advantage. He slammed his other hand against the locker next to Izuku's head, creating a small, crackling explosion for emphasis. "I'm not asking again, you damn nerd. Talk." That was the breaking point. The explosion, the smell of nitroglycerin, the heat, it was the final key in the lock of his PTSD. The world dissolved into a pure, undiluted flashback. "Get away from me!" Izuku screamed, the sound raw and desperate. It was not a plea. It was a command. And the power, a loyal and terrible servant, answered his terror. A wave of pure, concussive force erupted from his body. It wasn't a visible distortion like before. It was a silent, invisible shockwave of pure kinetic energy. The air in the locker room warped, and Bakugo, for all his strength and stability, was lifted off his feet as if by a giant hand. He was thrown backwards, flying a good 10 feet through the air before crashing into the opposite wall with a sickening thud. He slid to the floor, stunned, the air driven from his lungs, his ears ringing. The entire locker room fell silent. Everyone stared, frozen in shock. They had seen Izuku's power. A quiet, strange, defensive quirk. This was different. This was raw, untamed, and violent. But the effect on Izuku was even more dramatic. The moment the power flared, Aizawa, who had been waiting just outside the door, sensed it. He burst in, his eyes already glowing red, his capture weapon unfurling. Erasure. The power inside Izuku was cut off at the source. But the emotional dam had already broken. The terror, the memories, The pain of the past 6 years came flooding in, unmediated by his power, unprotected by the gray. It was too much. His mind, unable to cope with the sudden, violent influx of trauma, simply broke. He slid down the lockers, his body shaking uncontrollably. A gut-wrenching sob tore from his throat, then another, and another. He curled into a ball on the floor, his arms wrapped around his head as if to hold the shattered pieces of his sanity together. He was no longer a student, no longer a weapon. He was just a terrified, broken child, weeping on the floor of a locker room, lost in a nightmare that no one else could see. The students of Class 1A stared, their mouths agape. They saw Bakugo, the undisputed top of their class, groaning on the floor, taken down without a single touch. And they saw Izuku, the quiet enigma, having a complete and utter breakdown. For the first time, they understood. Their quiet, strange classmate wasn't just shy. He wasn't just weird. He wasn't arrogant, or aloof. He was damaged. Deeply, horrifically, and irreparably broken. And the power he possessed was not a gift. It was the legacy of whatever had broken him.